My hands were trembling as I picked up the prescription bottle from the counter. I could still feel the warmth of his fingers against my skin, that momentary touch that lingered longer than it should have. It was nothing just a doctor examining his patient's wife, yet in that fleeting second, something changed. Something I wasn't prepared for, something I never saw coming. I've replayed that moment in my mind 1,000 times, wondering if I imagined the way his eyes held mine just a heartbeat too long. My name is Olivia, and this is the story of how I almost lost everything because of a single touch. David and I had been married for 12 years. We had what most people would call a good marriage, a beautiful home in the suburbs, financial stability, and mutual respect. Love, too, though somewhere along the way it had transformed from the passionate flames of our early years into something more like a steady, comfortable warmth. That's normal, I told myself. That's what happens when you've been with someone for over a decade. The butterflies fade, and what remains is something deeper, more enduring. Then David got sick. It started with fatigue, which we both dismissed as overwork. David had always been ambitious, dedicated to his career as an architect. Late nights at the office were common, and I had grown accustomed to eating dinner alone more often than not. But when the fatigue turned into dizzy spells and persistent pain in his joints, even David couldn't ignore it anymore. The diagnosis wasn't life-threatening, an autoimmune condition that would require ongoing treatment and monitoring, but it was enough to disrupt our carefully constructed lives. David could no longer work the long hours he was accustomed to, and his energy levels fluctuated wildly. Some days, he seemed almost like his old self. Other days, he could barely get out of bed. Dr. Nathan Collins entered our lives 6 months after David's diagnosis. Our regular physician had recommended him as one of the best rheumatologists in the city, and after struggling with a treatment plan that wasn't working, we were desperate for a change. What we didn't expect was that he would suggest regular home visits. Given David's condition and how it affects his energy levels, Dr. Collins explained during our first consultation, "It might be easier if I came to you, at least for the regular checkups. I do this for several patients with similar conditions." I remember being surprised by the offer. House calls seemed like a relic from another era, but Dr. Collins spoke about them as if they were the most natural thing in the world. He was different from the other doctors we had seen younger, for one thing, probably in his late 30s. He had a quiet confidence about him, a way of explaining complex medical terms that made them understandable without being condescending. David agreed immediately, relieved at the thought of not having to drag himself to appointments on his bad days. And so it was settled. Dr. Collins would visit our home every 2 weeks to monitor David's condition and adjust his treatment as necessary. I didn't think much of it at first. Dr. Collins was just another healthcare professional in the revolving door of specialists we had seen since David's diagnosis. The first few visits were entirely unremarkable. He would arrive punctually, spend about 45 minutes with David in our living room turned examination space, and then leave with a professional nod and sometimes brief instructions for me about David's medications. The change happened so gradually that I didn't notice it until it was too late. Maybe it started with the way Dr. Collins Nathan, as he eventually asked us to call him, began to linger after David's examinations, accepting the offer of coffee that I made out of politeness. Maybe it was the way our conversations extended beyond David's health to books we'd both read, or films we'd both enjoyed. There was nothing inappropriate about it, nothing that crossed any obvious line. He was friendly, and God knows I needed someone to talk to. David's illness had isolated me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Our friends, well-meaning as they were, had slowly drifted away, uncomfortable with the unpredictability of David's condition and unsure of what to say or how to help. My own family lived on the other side of the country, and while we spoke regularly, it wasn't the same as having someone physically present. So when Nathan would sit at our kitchen table, sipping coffee and asking me about my day with what seemed like genuine interest, I didn't see any harm in it. I told myself it was good for David to a doctor who took the time to know his patients as people, not just collections of symptoms to be treated. It was during the 3rd month of his visits that something shifted. David was having a particularly rough day, barely able to move without wincing in pain. After the examination, Nathan adjusted his medication and then turned to me with concern in his eyes. "And how are you holding up, Olivia?" he asked, his voice soft. The question caught me off guard. Everyone always asked about David, about his symptoms, his pain levels, his progress. No one ever asked about me. "I'm fine," I said automatically, the response I'd trained myself to give. Nathan's eyes remained on mine, steady and knowing. "Are you, really?" And something in me cracked, just a little. Maybe it was the genuine concern in his voice, or the accumulated weight of months spent putting on a brave face. Whatever it was, I found myself speaking truthfully for the first time in months. "No," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "No, I'm not fine," he nodded, as if he'd known all along. "Why don't you tell me about it?" So I did. I told him about the loneliness, about how I missed the man David used to be, and then immediately felt guilty for even thinking such a thing. I told him about the constant worry, the way I would lie awake at night listening to David's breathing, afraid that somehow his condition would worsen while I slept. I told him about the dreams I'd put on hold, the art classes I'd wanted to take, the trips we'd planned but could no longer make. Nathan just listened, really listened, in a way no one had in a very long time. He didn't offer platitudes or try to fix the unfixable. He simply gave me space to voice the thoughts I'd been too afraid to acknowledge even to myself. When I finally fell silent, he reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. It was a gesture of comfort, nothing more. But in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years seen, not as David's wife or as a caretaker, but as Olivia, a woman with her own needs and fears and desires. I withdrew my hand quickly, as if his touch had burned me, and in a way it had. It had ignited something I thought had long since extinguished awareness of myself as something separate from my role as David's wife. "I'm sorry," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was apologizing for. "Don't be," Nathan replied quietly. "You have nothing to be sorry for." After he left, I stood in the kitchen for a long time, trying to understand the confusion of emotions swirling inside me. I told myself I was overreacting, that I was starved for human connection, and was reading too much into a simple act of kindness. Nathan was David's doctor, nothing more. The fact that he was kind, that he listened, that he seemed to understand, that was just part of what made him good at his job. But as the weeks passed, I found myself looking forward to his visits with an intensity that frightened me. I would spend more time getting ready on the days he was due to come, selecting my outfits with care, applying makeup I had largely abandoned since David's illness. I told myself it was because these visits were one of the few social interactions I had these days, that there was nothing wrong with wanting to look presentable. The lies we tell ourselves are often the most convincing. Nathan's visits continued to extend beyond what was strictly necessary for David's care. Sometimes he would arrive early, before David woke from his nap, and we would sit in the kitchen talking. Other times, he would stay after David had retreated to the bedroom, exhausted from the examination. It was during one of these extended visits that Nathan asked about the paintings hanging in our living room. "These are beautiful," he said, studying one particularly vibrant landscape. "Local artist," I felt a flush of pleasure and embarrassment. "Actually, they're mine from before everything changed." His eyebrows rose in surprise. "You're incredibly talented, Olivia. Do you still paint?" I shook my head, a familiar pang of regret washing over me. "Not anymore. There's not enough time, and the spare room we used as my studio is now full of medical equipment." "That's a shame," he said, and the genuine regret in his voice touched something deep inside me. "You shouldn't give up something you clearly have such passion for." I smiled ruefully. "Life doesn't always give us what we want." "No," he agreed, his eyes holding mine, "but sometimes it gives us what we need." The ambiguity of his words hung in the air between us, charged with possibilities neither of us had voiced but both of us had begun to feel. The moment was broken by the sound of David calling my name from the bedroom. I turned away quickly, my heart pounding as if I'd been caught doing something wrong, though we had only been talking. That night, as I lay next to David's sleeping form, I found myself thinking of Nathan, of his kind eyes, of the way he listened as if every word I spoke mattered, of the way he saw me as more than just David's caretaker. I thought of the spark I'd felt when he touched my hand, a spark that had been absent from my marriage for longer than I cared to admit. Guilt washed over me like a cold wave. David was sick. He needed me. And here I was, lying next to him, thinking of another man. What kind of person did that make me? I resolved to create some distance between myself and Nathan. I would be polite but not friendly. I would make sure David was awake before he arrived. I would offer coffee out of courtesy but not join him. I would reclaim the professional boundaries that had begun to blur. My resolution lasted exactly one visit. Nathan arrived the following week with a small package tucked under his arm. After examining David, who was having a relatively good day, he presented it to me. "I saw this and thought of you," he said simply. I unwrapped it to find a small, portable easel and a set of watercolors, compact enough to fit on our kitchen table. "Nathan, I can't accept this," I said, even as my fingers traced the edge of the easel with longing. "Yes, you can," he insisted gently. "It's not a grand gesture, Olivia. It's just a reminder that you're not just David's wife or his caretaker. You're still an artist. You're still you." I looked up at him, words failing me. In that small gift was something I hadn't realized I'd been missing: acknowledgement of the person I was beyond my role in David's life. David, sitting in his armchair across the room, looked between us with an expression I couldn't quite read. "That's very thoughtful of you, Doctor," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Olivia used to paint all the time. I've been telling her she should start again." The guilt that had been simmering inside me flared hot and bright. Had David noticed something? Was there even anything to notice? Nathan and I hadn't done anything wrong. We'd talked, that was all. He'd given me a thoughtful gift. There was nothing inappropriate about it. And yet, as I looked at the small easel in my hands, I knew that the gift represented something more: a connection, an understanding, a possibility that existed beyond the bounds of doctor and patient's wife. That night, David broke our usual silence as we prepared for bed. "Dr. Collins seems to have taken quite an interest in your well-being," he said, his tone casual but his eyes watchful. "He's just being kind," I replied, too quickly. "He can see how hard this has been." David nodded slowly. "He's a good doctor. Very attentive." I couldn't tell if there was an accusation buried in his words or if my own guilt was making me hear things that weren't there. I changed the subject quickly, asking about his pain levels and whether the new medication was helping. But as we lay in bed that night, I couldn't help but wonder if David had sensed the change in me, if he could somehow feel the confusion that had taken root in my heart. The next few weeks became an exercise in self-deception. I told myself that my feelings for Nathan were simply gratitude, that the flutter in my stomach when I heard his car pull into our driveway was nothing more than appreciation for his kindness. I told myself that the way I looked forward to our conversations, the way I found myself thinking of things to tell him during the days between his visits, was merely the natural result of my isolation. And yet, with each visit, the connection between us grew stronger. We never spoke of it directly, never acknowledged the current that ran beneath our interactions, but it was there in the way his gaze would linger on mine, in the way our conversations seemed to exist in a space separate from the reality of David's illness, in the way he would find small excuses to touch me a hand on my shoulder as he passed, fingers brushing as he handed me David's prescription. Each touch was innocent, explainable, and yet each one sent a jolt through me that was anything but innocent. It had been so long since I had felt that kind of awareness, that heightened sense of my own body, and I both craved and feared it. The moment everything changed was unremarkable in its ordinariness. It was a Tuesday afternoon, one of David's bad days. He had been in considerable pain and had taken a stronger dose of his medication, which had left him groggy and sleeping deeply. Nathan had finished his examination and written out a new prescription, which he handed to me in the kitchen while David slept. "This should help with the inflammation," he explained, "but it might make him even more tired for the first few days." I nodded, taking the prescription from him, our fingers brushing in what had become a familiar, dangerous dance of almost but not quite. But this time, instead of letting go, his hand closed gently around mine. "Olivia," he said softly, and something in the way he said my name made me look up at him. His eyes were serious, filled with an emotion I had been pretending not to see. "I think we need to talk about what's happening here." My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "Nothing is happening," I said, the denial automatic even as my body betrayed me, my pulse racing at his proximity. "Isn't it?" he asked, his voice low. His thumb traced a small circle on the inside of my wrist, a gesture so intimate it made my breath catch. "I think about you all the time. When I'm not here, I'm thinking about when I'll see you again. That's not nothing, Olivia." I should have pulled away. I should have reminded him of his professional ethics, of my marriage vows, of the man sleeping in the next room who needed both of us to be better than this. I should have done a lot of things. Instead, I stood frozen, caught between the truth of my own feelings and the weight of my responsibilities. "I can't," I whispered finally, though I made no move to withdraw my hand from his. "I know," he replied, and the sadness in his voice matched the ache in my chest. "I know you can't, but I needed you to know. I needed to say it, just once." He released my hand then, stepping back, creating a distance that felt both necessary and unbearable. I wanted to reach for him, to close that gap, to discover whether the electricity I felt between us would be as powerful as I imagined if we actually allowed ourselves to acknowledge it fully. Instead, I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the kitchen. "You should go," I said, my voice barely audible. He nodded, gathering his medical bag. At the door, he paused, looking back at me with an expression that held both regret and certainty. "I'll send another doctor for the next visit. Dr. Harris is excellent. She'll take good care of David." Panic surged through me at the thought of never seeing him again, immediately followed by a wave of self-disgust. What kind of person was I, to feel such desperation at the thought of losing someone who wasn't mine to lose? "You don't have to do that," I said quickly, then forced myself to add, "unless you think it's best." He studied me for a long moment. "What do you think is best, Olivia?" It was a loaded question, one that asked for more than just my preference about David's medical care. It asked for a decision about a path I had been afraid to even acknowledge existed. "I don't know," I admitted, and it was perhaps the most honest thing I had said in months. He nodded, accepting my uncertainty. "I'll come back next week, but Olivia, we both need to be clear about what we're doing here. For everyone's sake." After he left, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the prescription he had written, at the neat, precise letters of his handwriting. What was I doing? Was I really contemplating betraying David, even if only emotionally, while he was ill and needed me most? What kind of person did that make me? But another voice, quieter but persistent, asked a different question: what about me? Didn't I deserve happiness too? Didn't I deserve to feel alive, to be seen and valued as more than just a caretaker? I thought of Nathan's eyes, of the way he looked at me as if I were the most fascinating person he'd ever met. I thought of David, of the years we'd shared, of the promises we'd made to each other. I thought of the woman I had been before all of this, and the woman I was now, and wondered if they were even the same person anymore. That night, I took out the small easel Nathan had given me and set it up on the kitchen table. I opened the watercolors and stared at the blank paper, my mind as empty as the page before me. What did I want? What did I really want? I started to paint, not with any clear image in mind, just letting the colors flow. Red for passion, blue for loyalty, purple for confusion, green for growth. The image that emerged was abstract, chaotic, but somehow it made sense to me, a visual representation of the turmoil inside me. I was so absorbed in the painting that I didn't hear David until he spoke from the doorway. "You're painting again," he said softly, and there was something in his voice I hadn't heard in a long time, a mixture of surprise and pleasure. I turned to find him leaning against the doorframe, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Yes," I said, suddenly self-conscious, "just trying to sort through some things." He came closer, looking at the swirls of color on the paper. "It's good to see you doing this again. I've missed seeing you like this." There was a vulnerability in his words that caught me off guard. For so long, our conversations had revolved around his illness, his symptoms, his needs. This was the first time in months he had expressed something about me, about us. "David," I began, not sure what I wanted to say, but feeling a sudden, desperate need to reconnect with the man I had married, to find some echo of what we had once been to each other. "I know it's been hard." he said before I could continue. On both of us, I haven't been present. Even when I'm here, I haven't really been here. I stared at him, stunned by this unexpected moment of clarity. It's not your fault, I said automatically. You're sick, you can't help it. He shook his head. That's true, but it's not the whole truth. I've used my illness as an excuse to withdraw, not just physically, but emotionally. I've been so focused on what I've lost that I haven't appreciated what I still have, who I still have. Tears filled my eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. Was this really happening now, just when I had begun to believe that the connection between us had been irreparably damaged? David reached out, taking my hand in his, and I was struck by how different it felt from when Nathan had done the same thing just hours earlier. David's touch was familiar, comfortable, the touch of someone who knew me, who had shared a life with me. Nathan's had been exciting, new, filled with unspoken possibilities. But this was real. This was built on years of shared history, of love that had weathered more than just illness. I'm sorry, David said, his voice rough with emotion. I'm sorry I haven't been the husband you deserve. The words broke something in me, and I found myself crying in earnest, all the confusion and guilt and loneliness of the past months pouring out. David held me, his arms weaker than they once had been, but still strong enough to offer comfort. I've been so lonely, I admitted through my tears. I felt so invisible. I know, he said, and I could hear the pain in his voice. I know, and I'm sorry. But Olivia, you're not invisible to me. You never have been. We talked that night, really talked, for the first time in what felt like years. We talked about his illness, about how it had changed him, about how he had used it as a barrier to protect himself from feeling helpless. We talked about my loneliness, about the parts of myself I had set aside to become his caretaker. We talked about our marriage, about what we wanted it to be despite the challenges we faced. We didn't talk about Nathan. I couldn't bring myself to confess the emotional infidelity that had been building, the ways in which I had allowed myself to be drawn to him. But as David and I reconnected, as we found our way back to the partnership that had once been the foundation of our lives, I realized something important. What I had felt for Nathan wasn't love. It was escape. It was the allure of a life without the complications and pain that had become my daily reality. The next time Nathan came for his appointment, things were different. I made sure David and I were both present for the examination. I was polite but reserved, maintaining the professional distance that should have been there all along. If Nathan noticed the change, he didn't comment on it, but I saw the question in his eyes when our gazes briefly met. After he had finished with David, I walked him to the door as usual. But this time, when he turned to say goodbye, I spoke before he could. Thank you for the easel, I said quietly. It helped me remember something important. He looked at me for a long moment, understanding dawning in his eyes. You're painting again, I nodded. Yes, and talking. David and I are talking again. A shadow of something regret, perhaps, or resignation crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by a small, genuine smile. I'm glad to hear that, Olivia, truly. And I believed him, because despite the inappropriate feelings that had developed between us, Nathan was a good man who ultimately wanted what was best for his patients, for David, and yes, for me too. I think it would be best if Dr. Harris took over David's care from here, I said, the words difficult but necessary. Nathan nodded, accepting my decision without argument. I'll arrange it. She's excellent, as I said before. Thank you, I said, and we both knew I was thanking him for more than just his medical care. As I watched him drive away for the last time, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Something that might have been wonderful under different circumstances had ended before it truly began. But in its place was something more valuable, a renewed commitment to the life I had chosen, to the man I had promised to love in sickness and in health. That evening, I set up my easel again, this time in the living room where David could watch me paint. I chose a different scene this time, our garden, the one David had planted years ago and that I now maintained. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it was honest, and as I painted, I felt something settle within me, a sense of rightness, of being exactly where I belonged. Life isn't perfect. David's illness hasn't magically disappeared, and there are still days when the burden feels almost too heavy to bear. But we bear it together now, with a new understanding of what we mean to each other, of what we're willing to fight for. As for Nathan, I sometimes think of his kindness, of the way he saw me when I felt invisible, of the gift he gave me that ultimately led me back to myself and to my marriage. I hope he's found happiness. I hope he's found someone who can return his feelings without reservation or regret. And I've learned something important. Temptation doesn't always come in obvious packages. Sometimes it comes disguised as kindness, as understanding, as the simple acknowledgement of your worth. Sometimes the most dangerous touch isn't a passionate embrace, but a moment of connection when you're starved for it. But I've also learned that love, real love, the kind that endures, isn't about excitement or escape. It's about commitment, about choosing each other even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. It's about finding your way back to each other after you've been lost. His touch was a mistake, yes, but it was a mistake that, in its own way, saved my marriage. And for that, I can only be grateful.